Welcome to Southwestern Oregon Community College Indigenous Day celebration. We are here today to share Native culture and to celebrate the past, present, and future contribution of Native people. I want to thank college staff for helping us work out the space and technology for this beautiful event, and our wonderful guest speakers, Jesse Beers, Robert Kentta, and Peter Hatch, for sharing their in-depth knowledge. I'd also like to thank the Native artists who have agreed to let us share their YouTube videos. So please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. I'd also like to thank the Native Student Alliance Club, the International Club and their advisor, Forrest Ackers, the Associated Student Government, and the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee for hosting this important celebration. We'll start by looking at a very special map made by Aaron Carapella, who has set out to create the most accurate map possible of the locations and original names of tribes before colonization. As you can imagine, this was a very difficult task because so much information was lost due to forced relocation, disease, genocide, lost languages, and inaccurate names given to tribes arbitrarily by European settlers. At one glance, you can see that Native groups lived everywhere, and each family, tribe, or nation had their own unique language and incredibly rich and complex culture. In fact, my own job title here at SWOCC is Native American Student Coordinator. But because our Native students come from a variety of tribes with different levels of exposure to their culture, it feels more like a study of international relations. I'd like to note that the term federally recognized means an important government-to-government relationship, but it does not cover all the families and tribes that exist today. So we do try and call the tribes by their own names as best we are able to. One of the first artists that we have today is PAMYUA, a popular singing, dancing, and storytelling group from Alaska. They sing in Yupik and are often described as Inuit soul. One of the reasons why I like PAMYUA is that they are an example of how powerful storytelling is, and how sometimes it can even have a worldwide reach.
My name is Kajung. I'm from Bethel, Alaska, and I'm a member of PAMYUA.
My name is Asi.
My name is Karina.
Kitlak, Philip Blanchett. The core of PAMYUA are the four of us.
We never know in each performance how it's going to turn out because we don't have a set choreography. We have a story that we want to tell.
Yupik dancing, with the emotions, there's a lot of neck movements. And so when we have the mask, it transforms. All these motions begin to make sense.
And you become more aware of your own movements. You're not just making an impression of yourself, you're also reinterpreting that mask.
We've worked with so many wonderful artists over the years. We've actually traveled all over and done these festivals.
Russia several times and
China, Korea, Brazil.
We go there with just go out and look for musicians and invite them on stage with us.
That's where we've met so many of these artists that we've been inspired by.
Siku in Inuit means ice, and siku was composed by probably a hunter out in the wilderness with Mother Nature and was inspired to compose such a song.
We love that song, and we never get tired of performing it because it has so many elements and it's so dynamic.
It feels so good to make people happy and enjoy themselves, and afterwards they're just like, they want to just keep dancing, and you know, they feel this enjoyment and this energy, and that's what we try to put out there.
I hope that people just have a good time and get a little more understanding of what Yupik or Inuit culture is about and what life is about in the Arctic.
I only say that we have a place to tell others of how we see the world, just like everybody else.
Who knows what you're gonna see? Exactly. The same thing for us. That's what makes it so fresh and new and exciting for us. Not another day at the office.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Besides celebrating Indigenous Day, many organizations have also adopted the practice started in Canada in 2014 of saying a land acknowledgement statement before events or meetings to acknowledge the land that they are currently using was once occupied by Indigenous groups. The land where Southwestern Oregon Community College now stands was once enjoyed by many families and tribes. To help us learn the history and some of the traditions of those tribes, we are fortunate to be joined by Jesse Beers. Jesse Beers is the Cultural Stewardship Manager of the Confederated Tribes of Coos, Umpqua, and Siuslaw Indians.
Lisa, Diane, I'm not sure if you saw in the comments that people were asking about closed caption. I don't know how to do that. I don't know if that's something that is capable to do on your end. Or...
Thank you. I'll try and do that.
Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Everybody see that okay? So first of all, my name is Jesse Beers. I'm the Cultural Stewardship Manager for the Confederated Tribes of Coos, Umpqua, and Siuslaw Indians. I'm also Siuslaw Siuslaw. It just means that my Siuslaw Caucasian Umpqua person from Siuslaw territory. Siuslaw territory is within basically the Siuslaw watershed, the Siuslaw watershed. If you know where that is, up in the Florence area. And so that's where I come from. You may be in Coos Bay, you may be, we have people in Quebec, we have people all over. Wherever you are, there were and probably still are Native folks around, and it's important to remember that for the lands that you're on and the waters that you're on, that there's thousands of years of tradition in that area that helped steward those places for thousands of years, which I will get into a little bit in my presentation. So Hisa, thank you for having me here over this Zoom connection, and we'll just begin. So this is called Connection to Place. In our lands, in our waters, we're very connected to the places that we live. For those of us that still are blessed enough to live in this area, I'm presenting out of Florence today, and I live within my ancestral lands. I practice my culture within my ancestral lands, and I help through my job to use traditional ecological knowledge in order to help restore our waters and lands, not so much as a property ownership type restoration, but more of a restoration towards sustainability and stewardship. So So a little introduction into these lands. There's going to be a few maps probably in this presentation and maybe other presentations. The thing to know about maps is they're not always 100% accurate. And, you know, these are lines that are drawn overhead and represent at least some imagery for us to look at and understand kind of where we are. So the Siuslaw, the Coos, Kalawatset, we'll get into the language a little later, the Coos to the northern side and the Milik Coos to the southern side. These lands, these territories kind of take their names from our people today. Like, for example, actually we'll get into it a little bit, so I don't want to ruin that. But thousands of years of living in these areas, developing a culture through ceremony that helps steward these lands and areas. And today you have representation from a couple of different tribes that are traditionally of these people. We'll get into that a little bit as well. So a little introduction into these areas more specifically. Coos, you guys, SWOCC, are located in Coos Bay. Traditionally, it was known as Kukwis or Kukwishishime, which is just the Bay of the Coos people. And to the northern side, to really oversimplify it, because it really isn't the northern side of the bay, the southern side of the bay. It has to do with languages more and the divergence between languages, but that's another story for another day. You have Hanas to the northern side and Milik to the southern side. Today, the Hanas Coos are represented by Coos or Umpqua Siuslaw people, as well as Siletz people, as well as as well as Keauhou folks for the Milik. And then Milik people are represented by Siletz, Confederated tribes of Coos, Umpqua, Siuslaw Indians, as well as the Keauhou people. So we have many people in many different tribes today, and it has to do with what happened in the colonization of our people. So Kukwis is the name of the bay, Hanas to the northern side, Milik to the southern side. I should say that Hanas and Milik are people, not rivers, right? And Kukwis is the name of the river proper. Coos is the name of the river today, although that really, there's a pretty good debate over where that name came from, and there's many misunderstandings over what that name means. Just to clarify, it does not mean place of pines. That came from over east. So the Umpqua River, we have the Umpqua River to the north of the Coos River, and Queech is the name of the people that lived there and still live there. Iktatu is the name of the river proper, and then Kalawatset is another name that you'll see in many historical documents. And that came from explorers that were heading up north. Lewis and Clark and others asked people up there, can you name all the people to your south? And they said, yes, they can in their language, and that is Kalawatset. It's a Lower Umpqua word for the Lower Umpqua people in another language from up north. So you have that name that stuck around. Queech is the name that the people call themselves, which just translates to southerner, because they're southernmost Siuslaw people. And then Lower Umpqua is the name that is today given to them a lot because of the, again, colonization that happened, people coming from upriver saying, oh, there's people on the Lower Umpqua, this must be the Lower Umpqua, and it kind of stuck. But Queech, if you want to call us by our local name. Then Siuslaw. This is my favorite river. I'm super biased though. Waitoos in the foreground, the White Mountain that is not so white anymore due to a lot of factors. But Iktatu, the name of the river, which you'll notice is pretty much the same as the Umpqua River because slightly different dialect, the same language there. And it just means basically the big stem or the big river, the big water. Siuslaw, the name of the people, and a small creek that they kind of came from. Not to get into creation stories, it's a deeper dive. but Siuslaw, and then Siuslaw today, as it's known. And they were a good place to live, and they still are a good place to live. People lived within the landscape, they lived along the waters, they let the water tell them where to live, unlike today when a lot of people move the water around to suit their needs. And living for thousands of years in these places, stewarding these lands and waters for productivity, for abundance, for the next, as people say, the next 7 generations or longer, right? Using the traditions of your ancestors to live in a good way for your people that are yet to be here. And we have some pictures of some traditional foods: wapto, huckleberries, different clams, herring roe on eelgrass. And so I don't know if we'll have time for questions, but this is all good stuff, pictures. I always love pictures. So this is kind of getting into a science type view of our culture. So the intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. That is the definition of science. And we see our culture, and I'm only speaking for myself here really, but we see our culture as a type of science, being that, you know, science, you have these 5 to 10 year studies. Our ancestors, our traditions, our stories have this long view observation, right? This long view of observing the natural world, coming up with ceremonies in order to fill niches. And these ceremonies are spiritual things that we practice, but they also many times have biological niches. You know, talking about salmon ceremony, when you're stopping all fishing at the first fish to allow fish to go up. That's a ceremony that can allow for longer spawning of fish, and so it's a stewardship model as well to help those fish up. And it's not just a science, though. It's not just the observation. It's also what we call his hayach, gala delue, with a good heart. So practicing things in a way that we believe that whenever we do anything, we put a piece of ourselves into that. Like you'll see museums in baskets in museums, and when these museums, when these baskets are being woven, they're not being woven in a vacuum, right? There's things happening all around them. There's history happening all around them. There's DNA being put into those baskets through hair, through skin, through all these different things. And so those baskets have a piece of ourselves in them. And so it's good to practice those things with good hearts, because we want good energy going into those items, whether that be a talking circle or a talking circle stick, whether that be cooking our food in a traditional way, whether it be making drums or baskets or splitting planks. It's a way of living. When we canoe, we say all we leave behind is prayers and blessings in the water. So we're practicing it with a good heart, or his hayach, gala delue. And the water people are especially important here on the coast, for us at least. All water beings demand great respect, whether it be the salmon, the favorite child of the father of the food, or whether it be lamprey, or whether it be mussels, clams. Any of these different foods are super important and demand respect. And so, the current status of our water quality is very important to us, and that's a huge reason why we participate in so many water restoration projects. An example of the level of respect that was given traditionally, this is lamprey here. This is our current Chief Doc Slider, and council member Doug Barrett. We're harvesting lamprey, and traditionally the way in which you harvest lamprey is with a freshwater mussel shell, and that's what's happening in this picture. It's hard to see, but the freshwater mussel shell is the only way you're supposed to harvest lamprey traditionally. If you were going to be harvesting any other method, it was believed that you could bring on great rains, water raises, ruins your fishing for the season. So every, things that may seem little are every little thing is thought of when it's about being respectful to the water people. Because without the water, chi tayu, water is life, we don't survive. And when the tide is low, the table set. In these areas that we live and lived, we were so lucky to be able to live by the tides. We have fresh foods that are given to us and sometimes twice a day, right? And we have stories about how the tides are created through like the Crow and Thunderbird trade languages. And it's really hard today that we have to, check the water quality. We have to be very conscious of many different toxins in our foods and waters that we have to, before taking harvest of these first foods, which are so important to us to practice in our culture. So water, I mentioned chi tayu, water is life. Water breeds diversity in language and life. Wa'as ush tayu. And it's not just, the life of these beings, these water beings that we see here that are first foods in these examples. The frio grass is not first food, but has first food on it and is utilized for weaving. But also in life of us as human beings. So being able to stay in one place for thousands of years and not move around so much, not be have large village sites, large towns that we're living in, we're able to really settle down and create these smaller language groups, smaller language families, and a diversity of language up and down the coast. So if you're traveling by, canoe up and down the coast, may be beneficial for you to know Chinakwawa, I think was mentioned earlier, to a trade language, or today English, a trade language, but to know all these different languages in which you would need to speak. So if you're traveling north, you're speaking Millet, Conis is a different language. Siuslaw, which is spoken by both these tribes, different language. There's different language families all up and down the coast. Again, not the most super accurate map, but it makes the point that there are many different languages. It's like traveling across county lines and having different languages in different counties. So you need to know 2 to 3 languages. There's also speakers that advise you on how to speak in other areas or what the protocols were. And today we still, on Canoe Journey, for example, we still practice protocols when we travel to other tribal nations. And so that's living memory. That's the practice of old traditions in modern times and the carrying out those traditions to pass on to the next generations. Things that we still practice and are able to complete on a daily basis. And then we also have lands memory, where this is like the belief that when we practice traditional cultures in our territories, the ancestors are all around us, so we actually can gain memories through that, or even restoration models. So given the right circumstances, sometimes we'll see first foods coming back in the area when the right circumstances provide themselves. Like in this case, this is a camas field. It was a dairy farm prior, land changed ownership, and it's actually a trading area between Keauhou and Siuslaw people, lands traded area, and it became a camas field again because the right circumstances provided themselves, and we call that lands memory. So helping the lands and waters to recover through utilization of traditional ecological knowledge and practices. Really short U.S. history. A lot of people call this Indian history or Native history. I don't like to do that because this is not, what I was talking about before is more our history, our traditional stories, our oral traditions, our knowledge of stewardship and that. This is more, I feel like, what the United States did to us. And so it happened to us, and we didn't have a lot of choice in the matter. And where we did have choices, there were no good choices usually. So we have the main things I want to hit here is recognition of Aboriginal title had to be taken through treaty process. Treaty wasn't ratified. We were the lower Umpqua people and the Coos people were moved to the Great Coast Reservation. Later, that split into two halves, being the Siletz Reservation and the Alsea Sabiansi to the south. And when it was closed, another illegal move, it was closed in 1875. 1876, people were pushed out. They had to get all 19 headmen to sign off on that closure. Not one of them did, but it was communicated over east that we should have that reservation closed. There's not enough people, they're not utilizing their resources properly, and so people were moved off. They were told to go to the Siletz Reservation up north, and many did. I have cousins, Peter's one of them, in the Siletz Reservation, and some didn't. And that's kind of the people from our tribe are some of the last some of the remnants of that people that went back home. Especially for the Siuslaw people, our tribal lands, we were, I guess you could say, lucky enough to be within the boundaries mostly of the reservation. And so we were able to stay on our lands for the most part, because once you remove the reservation, it was a really poor scenario for many people to plan to harvest wheat and corn and potatoes on the Oregon coast. It doesn't work very well. And so you had a huge die-off rate. It was just a super difficult time, after which things didn't get much better. Our tribes worked together, including many other tribes, to try to get lands back, get payment for lands, for something good to come out of all this. We had our court of claims case. It was thrown out as hearsay, and we continued fighting during that time. Boarding schools are being talked about a lot today. We do have family members that went to boarding schools. We have family members that never came back from boarding schools. We have family members that still today we will be getting back soon from boarding schools. So termination 54, that happened, and from that time on, our tribes kind of changed the fight from getting lands back, getting payments back, to just being federally recognized again, so that we can have education services and health services and all these different things that people had gained accustomed to a little bit. And this is just a bunch of my personal paperwork about my family. And restoration happened in 1984 through our tribe, for our tribe. Every tribe has their own, if they're terminated, has their own restoration year. It came through a lot of hard work of people pooling funds and going to DC and fighting on people's behalves. And I was 2 years old when it happened, and you can do the math there. But one of these people is still alive. I had the benefit of traveling with a couple of these people during our building of our tribal peacekeeping court, which was an amazing experience. So today we do have a tribal government. We're a sovereign nation within a nation, as are the other 8 federally recognized tribes in the Oregon, in what is today named Oregon. And this is kind of how ours is built. Not every tribe is the same, but this gives you an idea of how ours is. We have the general council up here, which is all of us tribal members. We have an elected tribal council, including the chief. And then we have our court system, our department, resource stewardship, finance, law enforcement, all those things, education. We're just a little nation here on the coast of Oregon. This is a closer look at our resource stewardship group, our department, because we believe, as made apparent through our traditions, right, where I was talking earlier, that cultural resources and natural resources are one and the same. We cannot practice our culture without a healthy environment, and our environment cannot function properly without our culture assisting it. So it's very important to us to practice both, encourage both, and we do that through cultural resource protection, monitoring. We do that through marine planning, working with multiple state and federal agencies for marine planning, as well as tribes. We do that by water quality monitoring in our areas, on our rivers, on our waterways. When we're canoeing, sometimes we've done that on canoe journey, which is a pain for a steers person to have that equipment wrapped around your leg as you're canoeing, but it's interesting data. We do that by working with local watershed councils. So whether that be Coos, 10 Mile, Mid Coast, Siuslaw, we do that in order to help protect our watersheds, because the ocean is a huge piece which we don't have a lot of control over, but the rivers, waterways in our territories, that's something we can have more control over. And so we are working hard to restore those with other state fed tribal partners, as well as watershed groups. And it's important to encourage your kids to do the same. So we do that as well by helping propagate traditional native plants that are important to our culture, so we can incorporate those in restoration methods, right? So when we restore a place, we want to encourage native plants that we utilize specifically for our cultural practices. Whether that be first foods like camas or weaving material, or wapato here, or in some cases, very small cases, traditional tobacco, because that's ceremonial and sacred. We also do it by lamprey conservation, which I wanted to put this slide on here because I know it's not the most popular fish out there with a lot of folks, but it's very important for us as a people. All the water people demand respect, as we talked about earlier. And so the lamprey are very important to us to restore in our territories. It's a native, it's important to the ecosystem, and it's important to us. So as mentioned throughout this, stewardship is culture, culture is prevention. And so that's how we really want to work with our youth and our adults in maintaining stewardship of our lands and waters for all of our benefit. And then doing that also through teaching culture, because that's one and the same in our eyes, or at least a lot of overlap. And we do that in normal times, pre-COVID, by doing camps and activities. Today we have a lot of online, kind of like this, classes that we teach weaving, we teach all kinds of different things, but we're striving and hoping and doing our part to hopefully in the future be more into this again, doing camps and activities with our youth, that we can really get them out there on the water, or clamming and crabbing and practicing all those traditional activities that we love to do. And teaching this we can do online quite a bit. We have been doing this quite a bit during COVID, is strengthening our classes for language, for weaving, for tool making, for talking circles, for traditional court practices, etc. So that's a good thing, but still love to be out in the water in the canoes. And also community outreach, which I believe this is, doing outreach with our communities, whether that be our Native community, whether that be Dominant Society community. We're out there speaking, teaching, or doing restoration work also is a way of doing outreach, because we're not doing that in a vacuum either. Like weaving, we're doing it all around here with people observing, noticing, taking questions. So Hisa, Louie, thank you in 2 different languages. These are just kind of some pictures of us practicing what we love to do, whether that be land ceremonies, or whether that be traditional cooking methods classes, or whether that be protocol. This is protocol up in Washington when we're on canoe journey. I mentioned earlier about protocol. Couple different things. We don't allow our canoe to touch other people's lands without first asking permission, and we're there to share songs and dances with folks. So they give us somewhere to sleep, and we give them songs and dances. So it's a reciprocal relationship there. So that's protocol there. Or using the canoe as healing for our young people. Healing of the canoe is what we call that, and practiced by many different tribes, and getting that out there on the water. We do have a program coming up. I may be going over my time, I don't know. We do have a program coming up that we're really excited about, that we're going to be working on family canoes, so we can have smaller canoes and have that social distance happening, and so people will be able to get out on the water again in this traditional way, because we tried this a couple different times. We had, you know, COVID exposure, COVID scares, and so we pulled that back again, and so we're not able to do that at this time. And we look forward to, in the very near future, doing that again, because it's so important for us and our culture. So. Lisa, Louis. This is sunrise, by the way, so get up early.
Thank you, Jesse. That was absolutely amazing. And I know for a lot of folks, this is just the tip of the iceberg. We have a lot of questions. So we hope to host some panelist talks in the future where we can have a dialogue. Thank you. So the next artist that I would like to feature is Supaman. And he's a remarkable young man. He had a rough childhood, and he later became a rapper, a fancy dancer, artist, videographer. And he's a real good example of learning what you can and then giving back to your community. So one of the things that we try and tell our students is to try every day to be the best version of yourself, to go, to learn, and then give back to your families and your community. In this particular video, it's entitled I Hope You Know, and it features the voice of Ashley Hall. She is a young singer from the Dakotas. And so this particular video was made for Mother's Day to honor all the mothers and aunts and grandmothers who help share their traditions and carry on the families.
hope you know you've always been the one. I hope you know I'll never break your heart in two. I hope you know there's no one else like you. Hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh. Hey, ya, 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 hey, oh, hey. Hey, ya, hey, ya, hey, ha, oh, hey. Hey, ya, hey, ya, hey, oh, hey. Hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh. I hope you know I never wanna see you go. I hope you know you've always been the one. I hope you know I'll never break your heart in two. I hope you know there's no one else like you. Hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh. Hey, ya, hey, ya, hey, ho, oh, hey. Hey, ya, hey, ya, hey, oh, hey. Hey, ya, hey, ya, hey, ha, oh, hey. Hey, ya, hey, ya, hey, oh, hey. Hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh. I hope you know I never wanna see you go. I hope you know you've always been the one. I hope you know I'll never break your heart in two. I hope you know there's no one else like you. Ay, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh.
It's time to reconnect with travel. Kayak searches hundreds of travel sites and shows you which flights are waiving change fees.
Sorry for the delay. I am multitasking several screens. Our next guest is Robert Kentta. He is a cultural resource director and tribal council member from the Confederated tribe of Siletz.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me on. My name is Robert Kentta. I'm the Cultural Resources Director and an elected council member for the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, the Siletz Tribal Council. I've worked in cultural programs here for about 30 years. My tribal ancestry is from Upper Klamath River and Rogue Valley. My great-grandfather and great-great-grandmother were brought here to the reservation in the 1850s after the Rogue River Wars. I also am half Finn. My father's parents were both born in Finland and have some German and Irish ancestry as well. So I look like my Finnish cousins. It's not advancing the slides.
You try left clicking. can either try double clicking or left clicking. We apologize. It's part of being virtual.
Yeah, seems frozen up. So I will continue toying with it, see if I can.
Actually, Robert, I have another music video, of course. So what we'll do is I'll go ahead and play that, and then we'll come back. That still working?
Yeah, I stopped sharing. Go ahead.
Okay. Okay. So while Robert works out the technology thing, believe me, we are trying. I would like to introduce the Keauhou Band. This particular band is an example of how language can transcend generations. And I know that a lot of our students are also trying to learn their own language. And of course, that is very challenging for anybody, but especially if it's a language that is only carried on by a few elders.
Hello, my name is Elakha Alliance. I'm the choral director at the Kamehameha School's Kapalama.
Aloha, my name is Jonah Kahanuola Solatorio. I'm currently a Kumu'ulelo Hawaii, a Hawaiian language teacher at the Kamehameha School's Kapalama campus.
Aloha, my name is Nicholas Keili Ilum, and I'm currently a master's student at the University of Hawaii at Manoa in the Wolelo Hawaii program, Hawaiian language. And I also work as a graduate assistant in the College of Ed under the Hawaiian Immersion Project.
To me, Keauhou is revitalization. It is a revitalization of a Hawaiian lifestyle. Keauhou is important for our future generations as well as for our kupuna's generations. And Keauhou is important for us now.
We'll be able to connect with what our kupuna saw, and in that sense we are able to connect to our kupuna who have gone away but yet are still connected to us through mele.
We're trying to reintroduce something that is not new, but we are renewing it so that people can be carried by it, or that people can be swept away in a beautiful way by it. Something that's for us today, not just for yesterday. And then it eventually play itself out tomorrow. So that's e ko'olau ke koa Keauhou.
Nani Ko'olau a he po'anu ka iniki vela vela o ka makasila hila ila ka ua e vale ai me ka vai o ka ulala e ho me ka vai o ka ulala e ho Nani Ko'olau a he po'anu ka iniki vela vela o ka makasila hila ila ka ua e vale ai me ka vai o ka ulala e ho me ka vai o ka ulala e ho a hiki ka ua inu uanu a inu I ka vai o silosia ila ila ka ua ihi o lani ai me ka vai o ka ulala e ho me ka vai o ka ulala e ho Nani Ko'olau a he po'anu ka iniki vela vela o ka makasila ila ila ka ua e vale ai me ka vai o ka ulala e ho me ka vai o ka ulala e ho ila ila kuo I ka ponei ua pa'a ko pukai Nani Ko'olau a he poanu Ka iniki vela vela o ka makasila Ila ka ua e wale ai Me ka vai o ka ulala e ho Me ka vai o ka ulala e ho Nani Ko'olau a he poanu Ka iniki vela vela o ka makasila Ila ka ua e wale ai Me ka vai o ka ulala e ho Me ka vai o ka ulala e ho Me ka vai o ka ulala e ho
They are amazing. Just their language and also their sound. Okay, so we're going to go back to Robert Kentta, and hopefully we have all the technology figured out. Robert?
Robert, you are muted.
Thanks again for your patience, trying to operate without my glasses. That's what happens when you get elderly. So I've been working in the program about 30 years, and when I initially started in the position, it was under a National Park Service Historic Preservation Fund grant. And we got a series of three of those multi-year grants. And then my position was moved under tribal government to kind of add stability to the program and start building it up. Later, you'll hear from my co-worker, Peter Hatch, with some important work that we're also participating in. This photo is some of our Siletz ancestors around 1910 on the Newport Bayfront, when during a time period when our ceremonies were really outlawed. And once in a while, like 4th of July celebrations, they would invite us to open up our trunks of regalia and put that regalia on and put on a dance, not as a ceremony because that was outlawed, but as a exhibition, kind of a showpiece for non-native folks, especially. When our people put on our dances ourselves in a more ceremonial way, they would have to kind of hide it, do it in hiding, and put away the regalia at a certain point in the night when they were worried about the agent and his employees coming to break up the ceremony. And we seem to be back to frozen up.
Shoot, let me try firing up the slides on my side, Robert. We'll see if that works better.
In the meantime, so I will stop share.
Yeah.
Okay, Peter, you have them up and running then?
I think so. Are you seeing them?
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, so our Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians has descended from basically all the tribes and bands of Western Oregon. You see the kind of gray line 2/3 of the way across the map. That's basically the summit of the Cascade Range in Oregon. And it follows basically down the north shore of the Columbia River to its mouth, down the coast into California, along the Smith River, especially Crescent City area, excluding the lower Klamath River, and then including again kind of north central California with the Scott River, Shasta River, Upper Klamath River areas of Shasta Territory, then back up the summit of the Cascade Range again. So our history has been pretty difficult, and similar to Jesse was sharing earlier with maps showing our ancestral territories and linguistics. This is color coded and showing basically the language groupings of people before treaties were signed and our people forced to move to reservations. So our people are basically descended from 11 different languages, and those are broken up between 5 major language families. And as Jesse's map showed earlier too, there's broad swaths of North America where there's basically just one language group over a broad area. And Western Oregon is one of the most linguistically diverse regions of the United States in total. And also pretty culturally diverse, because the Willamette Valley is very different from the Rogue Valley and Upper Klamath River. The Northern Oregon coast is somewhat different from the Southern Oregon coast. And people were very sedentary, moved throughout their village territory over the seasons, but also then came back to their main winter village, a permanent home base, after gathering those resources kind of throughout the territory during the summer. Our people were pretty diverse in their diet as well. Some people, like interior southern Willamette Valley especially, had more difficult access to more of the anadromous fish runs. People think of all Pacific Northwest Indians as being salmon eaters, and that's true to some extent, but some people, if they were wanting a big part of fish in their diet, they would have to trade with other people for it, people who had a better access to it. So trade relations were really important to our people, and that's part of probably what maintained that linguistic and cultural diversity throughout our Western Oregon area especially. Marriage relations were encouraged. It was high status for you to bring your wife from some distance away for a variety of reasons, including genetics, but it also created trade opportunities and relationship building, so that most children growing up had their father's home village country, because the wife generally came to the husband's village and raised her children as her husband's people. But the wife was often from a different language family, and the father's mother, if she was still alive in the village, she would have probably come from another language. So linguistic diversity and the sharing of those things, people growing up speaking multiple languages, or at least having exposure to them, gave a lot of opportunity for exchange of ideas. Things as basic as our basketry, there's a number of different techniques in different materials throughout Western Oregon. Some is coiled basketry. There's a number of different twining techniques, even employment of designs. The graphics of our artwork change from river valley to river valley, so we're able to more or less pinpoint when an artifact is shown to us pretty much where it came from. Go ahead and move on to the next one, Peter. So that was our Aboriginal territory situation starting in the very early 1850s. treaties started being imposed on our people. There had been early Hudson Bay Company activity, and some of that was violent exchange. If our people opposed Hudson Bay Company employees coming into our territory and actually setting their own traps, that was considered an invasion and a taking of our resources. And sometimes those people were punished for doing those things. And when word got back to Fort Vancouver, just on the north side of the Columbia, north of Portland, then they would send out a brigade to punish our people for opposing their efforts. Now, when that early trade went on, either from trade ships on the coast or Hudson Bay Company people sent out people to buy furs from us, that was a more friendly relationship. But once they got to know the lay of the land and started acting like they had a right to take our resources without trading for them, then that caused problems. Another increase in that difficulty was when land-based settlement started taking place. Early settlers included retired Hudson Bay Company people, many of whom were married to Native people of various tribes, but many of them settled in the northern part of the Willamette Valley, a place called French Prairie, and it's called that because many of them were French Canadian people who had worked for the Hudson Bay Company and stayed in Oregon Territory when they retired. Those kinds of relationships were a little less intrusive, especially in the Willamette Valley, where our tribal people's population had been so decimated by the epidemics. Eventually, though, wagon trains started showing up in the 1840s. There was a cattle company that formed, I think, 1830s, by them traveling from the Willamette Valley down into California and buying Spanish cattle, hundreds of head, and marching them north through our territories to the Willamette Valley. And that created its own problems. Because our people opposed people moving through our territories without permission and while taking our resources and disrespecting our people, we were seen as an obstacle to white settlement and treated pretty harshly. Eventually wars broke out, and that sort of triggered the need for treaties to be signed. US Constitution has always recognized that Indian people Native people have the right to occupy their home territory until that Aboriginal title, it's called, was purchased by the United States, and some sort of accommodation made for those Native people through that treaty. So what happened was, though, there was basically kind of a forced occupation of our lands, taking of our resources, and then there would be treaties negotiated. And in some cases, those were ratified by the US Senate and proclaimed by the law by the president and actually officially enacted, even though maybe not all the provisions were carried out on the part of the United States. The tribes were held to those terms of those treaties. So in 1853, you can see kind of a pinkish tone down in West Oregon in the interior there. Yes, the Rogue Valley. That was the first treaty signed in the American West. All of the now states of Western United States that went through the official ratification process. And it was signed at the Table Rocks September 10th of 1853 at the end of a bloody war. And it promised our people to permanently reserve the Table Rocks area as a temporary reservation and cede the rest of that territory to the United States. And as a general rule, the treaties dictated that our people gave up those lands for about 2.5 cents an acre, which even in those days was pretty pitiful. especially for the number of tribal people that amount was supposed to assist going forward. So the Table Rock Temporary Reservation was set up a year later. A lot of the tribes that were supposed to be on the Table Rock Reservation had unceded territory to the west in the Mid-Rogue River region. So a agreement was signed, another treaty with the tribes on the Table Rock Reservation, getting their permission to have others added to them. So that was the foundation of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, the beginnings of our Confederation. So in November of 1854, then the Mid-Rogue River people up through the Illinois Valley signed that supplementary treaty, also moved to the Table Rock Reservation. The Cow Creek Treaty had already been signed in a few days after the Table Rock Treaty in September of 1853, and then a succession of treaties through the Umpqua Valley and Willamette Valley. All of those basically promised the same thing, that our people would be protected in our rights either to the temporary reservation, or if the President of the United States selected a permanent reservation for us, then we would move there. The Coos Treaty, which is basically all of the green area, including the long bluish rectangle along the northern central coast there, all of that area was to be ceded under one treaty. And as Jesse mentioned, there were treaty signing parties up and down the coast. People agreed to give up their territory under the provisions of the treaty. The treaty never was ratified, but those people were forcefully removed to the reservation, or those living already within the reservation were forced to have others moved in among them, and competition for their traditional fisheries and all of those things went into effect without any compensation. So the Oregon Territory had been established by act of Congress in 1848, and it was specifically protective of our tribal people's rights through extension of what was called the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And 1787, the Northwest they were referring to was the Ohio Valley, expansion into that territory. And it said that the Indians' rights and rights to peaceful occupation of their soil and property wouldn't be disturbed. They wouldn't be invaded unless through just and lawful wars authorized by Congress. But what happened prior to any treaties being signed in the Oregon Territory was Congress passed the Oregon Donation Land Act, which I think it was passed in 1850. And it promised a square mile, 640 acres, to a man and his wife arriving in the Oregon Territory or already arrived there if they settled under rights as a U.S. citizen. So our people started being displaced from their best places, their food gathering areas that they'd maintained for centuries, their best fisheries, their village sites at the mouths of rivers or junctions of streams. Many of those places were taken up in donation land claims before a treaty had even been signed. So that's what created a lot of the disturbance of our people and hard feelings and conflict. About the same time as the Donation Land Act being passed, gold was also discovered in Northern California and Southern Oregon. And the gold rush, of course, exacerbated all of those problems. Go ahead and advance on, Peter. So in 1855, April of 1855, the Superintendent of Indian Affairs for Oregon sent this map to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C. and said that there is this stretch of the coast that has yet to have a non-Indian settler on it, and it's the best choice for a permanent reservation for all the Western Oregon tribes. So he kind of did his unofficial designation sent that map and asked for the Commissioner of Indian Affairs to follow through with whatever official action needed to happen for that reservation to be established. And the map was lost, separated from the correspondence for a while. In the meantime, the last stage of the Rogue River Wars broke out, and our people were subjected to really a war of extermination. A lot of the Oregon newspapers said, advocated for extermination of our Indian people so that there wouldn't be a need for a reservation. So it was a really difficult time. In the meantime, the Coast Treaty was being negotiated, and because there was word already that there was opposition to such a large reservation being created in Western Oregon, under the terms of the Coast Treaty, the reservation would have only been about 800,000 acres instead of 1.1 million. But 3 days before the draft of the Coast Treaty that had the signatures on it arrived in Washington, D.C., finally the map, the correspondence, and all of the communications between the different departments, Secretary of the Interior, Secretary of the General Land Office, and all of those folks fell into place. And the president signed off on this larger reservation being created November 9th of 1855. So pretty quickly, our people started being removed to the reservation. And this map shows a lot of the removal routes that our people were forced to either march or ride in a wagon if they were quite elderly and unable to walk. People were marched down the Rogue River and other places on the coast to Port Orford, loaded on a ship, and that's the dotted blue and yellow line going up the coast and up the Columbia to Willamette Falls, offloaded and taken on smaller boats, and then walked and rode in wagons to Dayton and on to what was then called the Grand Round Encampment. And the government bought a couple of small donation land claims from early settlers there just off of our northeast reservation boundary and made it a staging area for removal to the reservation. But so quickly they had so many Indian people concentrated there with difficulties in delivering enough supplies that they sent all the Southern Oregon coast people over to the mouth of Salmon River and Siletz Bay to fend for themselves. And that caused conflict with the local tribes and competition over fisheries that I was mentioning earlier. Eventually those tribes moved farther south to Yaquina Bay, which then caused problems with those local people. And in the spring of 1857, most of those people were marched from Yaquina Bay to the Siletz Valley, where Siletz Agency, the headquarters for the entire reservation, was established. And also the majority of the upper Rogue Valley people that were at the Grand Round Encampment were marched down through the western fringes of the Willamette Valley and over the hill to the upper Siletz River, which was called Upper Farm. So my great-grandfather was part of that march as a young boy. And he described a lot of the difficulties that people had, and his parents had been both killed in the Rogue River Wars. So he was raised as an orphan boy here on the reservation. And this map shows reductions to the reservation that happened over time. 10 years after it was created, a group of scandalous politicians were looking for a way to open up our reservation. And they described in a letter to the, got the Secretary of the Interior to write a letter that the president would then sign off on. And it said there was a small and rugged portion of the coast reservation not occupied or desired by the Indians. And whereas it would be a great benefit to the settlers of Willamette Valley to have access to the coast, we think this should be opened. And it wasn't small. It might have been partially rugged. It was about 200,000 acres out of our reservation promised to us by treaty and should have been under full protection through the ratified treaties of the people already placed at Upper Farm. But it took that 200,000 acres out, and as Jesse mentioned earlier, it severed our Siletz reservation into two pieces. The northern part after that was just called Siletz Agency. And then the southern part was administered through the Yahut Sub-Agency, or LC reservation, it was sometimes informally called. So another 10 years went by, and a unscrupulous Oregon Senator, John Hipple Mitchell, got a rider to the annual appropriations bill for fulfilling treaty agreements signed or introduced as a bill as a rider to that annual appropriations bill. And it stipulated that the entire southern sub-agency would be closed down, and the northern half of the northern part of the remaining reservation would also be open to settlement. That included about 700,000 acres of our reservation. And he proposed it as a measure of economy so that the sub-agency down south wouldn't have to be maintained, and all of the Indian people on the reservation would be concentrated in the about 225,000 acres of the reservation that would be left. So he still couldn't get enough support for that being included in that bill. So he had to add a proviso that the action would not take place unless the Indian people consented to it. And there was a number of meetings down at Yahut's and some up on the northern end of the reservation that didn't ask for their consent. It just said that the Congress had passed this act and they needed to comply, but our people still resisted. And eventually representatives who had been sent to talk to our people just reported that our people gave consent, even though it's pretty obvious that they never really did. So through those illegal means in 1865 and 1875, we lost about 3/4 of our reservation mass in the first 20 years. After 1875, our reservation was the 225,000 acres. And in 1892, the General Allotment Act was applied to our reservation. Actually, it started in 1891. They started surveying our bottomlands near the rivers and bigger creeks and along the coastline into 80-acre parcels or 240-acre parcels that our tribal members would be assigned. And the government would hold those parcels called allotments in trust for those individuals until they were deemed what the government called a competent Indian who could speak English well enough and handle their business affairs like the average US citizen. Then they would get citizen status and get clear title to their allotment and no longer be considered a ward of the government, which was part of federal policy's designation of our native people. So one of the provisions of the General Allotment Act that was being used, it was an act passed by Congress in 1887, and it said that once all the Indians on that reservation had been assigned a parcel, the Secretary of the Interior could declare the rest of that reservation surplus and basically force the tribes to cede those territories. So before even all of our tribal people on the reservation had been confirmed in their allotments, the Secretary of the Interior declared the rest of the reservation surplus and sent a delegation of people to negotiate with us in good faith, it said, in the directions of the letter. But they basically said that our lands were worthless. Even the timber standing on it was of no value because there was it was remote and inaccessible. A number of meetings were held. Some of our elders even got up and said, what about the value of the timber? It looks like this thing's going to happen no matter what we say or what we want. So what about the value of the timber? And those people said, it's worthless. It'll rot on the ground where it stands today because it has no access. So Halloween Day of 1892, the agreement was signed by the majority of the adult males on the reservation at the time. There's stories of all kinds of threats that were being issued, and actually they, in the meeting minutes, they said, if you folks don't accept this 74 cents an acre, it can be taken just like the 1865 and 1875 reductions, and you won't get anything for it. So that was their supposed negotiation in good faith with our people. So the agreement was signed Halloween Day, and the cover letter that accompanied the document back to Washington, D.C. for congressional approval said, dense stands of valuable timber with many rapidly running streams as a means of getting the timber out. So they were talking about building splash dams and floating the logs out from even upper stretches of watersheds. So it was just another example of how our people were taken advantage of, and what should have been promised assets and future inheritance of all of our tribal people was taken. By 1912, the Siletz agent noted that over half of our 551 80-acre allotments that were issued were already non-Indian owned. One of the provisions they used to induce our people to sign the agreement was there was 5 sections of basically a square mile each. And those are the kind of cross-hatched diagonal line parcels that for the most part are accessible near the river for floating logs, but most of them are downstream of the Siletz Agency mill, and one is clear over just inland from Depot Bay on the coast. So in the early 1890s, I don't know how they thought our people were going to benefit from those 5 sections of tribal timber reserve that we could use commercially if we gave up the 191,000 acres. There was a book written by a man sitting in prison in 1908. He was in prison for land fraud, and he wrote a book called Looters of the Public Domain. And I think it's chapter 30 of that book that's dedicated to how the government cheated us out of that remaining reservation land in 1892. Go ahead and move on, Peter. Thanks. Yeah, so that's a photo of Government Hill, the old agency buildings where there was a boarding school and dormitory, doctor's office, agent's house, and rows of school buildings. Most Indian schools were called a manual labor school. So they would teach like blacksmithing and shoemaking and all those kinds of things to the boys, and had like domestic service classes for the girls so that they could keep house for wealthy non-Indian families. So that was how Government Hill looked in those days when my grandmother was small. And now none of those buildings are standing. That's our powwow grounds. And it's called Government Hill in those days, especially because it was all US government buildings, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. But now it's still kind of this ancient seat of our tribal government. During the 1930s, a tribal council meeting hall was built up there by our people and other facilities. Yeah, go ahead and move on, Peter. This is a photo of especially after our reservation was so diminished and non-Indian people moved in among us and started using our fish and wildlife resources. That subsistence lifestyle was very difficult to maintain. So early 1900s on, especially, our tribal folks would go in wagon caravans out to the Willamette Valley and help with things like the hop harvest. In this photo, about 2/3 or 3/4 of the people in the photo are Siletz tribal members helping with a hop harvest. This is 5 generations of one of our Siletz families. I knew the elder in the baby basket there. He was born early 1900s. Stanley Strong, his mother is to the right there, and then her mother is to the far right. Her mother is the other one with the baby basket on her lap, Molly Carmichael. And then her mother is the tiny little lady standing there to the far left. And this was, there were a number of these photos taken of the 5 generations of that family. And they were pretty well known for posing for those photos. All of the women in that family were some of our best basket makers during their lifetimes. This was our tribal chairman that during the 1950s, Jesse referred to it, that termination happened for all Western Oregon tribes. Basically at that time, there was the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, Confederated Tribes of Grand Round, that were federally recognized governments, but then also they named every tribe and band that had ever been listed on a federal document or referred to in history, to make sure that they wiped out all tribal entities within Western Oregon. And our government hill land was given to the city by the tribe instead of sold. The government sold off basically the majority of our allotments and the few that remained anyway, and those tribal timber reserves, and everybody got a small check. And then the government said that they were done with recognizing a Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians. Art Bensel was born in that hospital in the early 1900s, and we got that property back through our restoration process. The city eventually returned it to us after multiple votes that they could not believe. The majority of citizens of the town of Siletz agreed that the property should be returned to the tribe, so they had multiple votes. And eventually the city government had to bite the bullet and turn the title back over to us. So Art Bensel was photographed in what had been the hospital building, but right about the time that the land returned to us, it somehow caught fire and burnt to the ground. It was basically the last of those historic buildings on the hill. Go ahead. So the restoration process was long and difficult. Only one other tribe had been restored to federal recognition before us, and that was the Menominee tribe of Wisconsin. And they had been basically converted to a corporation during their termination years. They weren't liquidated like us. So they still had land holdings that had turned into like a corporate asset, and the tribal members were all shareholders. We were the first landless tribe, and so our situation was a bit different. They were restored in 1973, and we requested the assistance of the Native American Rights Fund attorney team. Some of you may be familiar with John and Walter Echo Hawk, two Pawnee brothers that started that legal firm to assist tribes with their pursuing their rights. So NARF sent an attorney to us, Charles Wilkinson, non-native attorney, who's done some of the most complex legal review of federal Indian law, text materials for teaching of federal Indian law. And he was sent from Colorado to us to assist with our restoration. And this is our tribal council at the time, 1976, I think, hearing on our restoration bill. 1977, our bill was passed and signed into law by President Jimmy Carter. And next slide. So this is a booklet that was put together as part of our restoration celebration, and lots of historic photos in there that families allowed to be copied for the booklet. And this is the now 11 county service area, but it started out as an 8 county service area designated under our Restoration Act for being able, the tribe being able to spend tribal program funds as if that area was on or near the reservation. There's federal regulations on how tribal funding can be expended, and because we were landless at the time, the 8-county service area was designated in our legislation, and then later we added the Portland metro area counties because so many of our tribal members lived in that area as well. And next slide. So starting in the 1870s, our tribe started forming government and processes of a representative government of all the Confederated tribes. We have a number of different versions of constitutions going back at least to the 1880s. And so when we reorganized and got federal recognition restored in 1977, some of the things that we had actually rejected in earlier eras of Bureau of Indian Affairs sort of dictating what happened for the tribe, some of those things we actually voted down that the BIA and the US government was really trying to push on us. And one of those was forming under the Indian Reorganization Act 1934. So we had to kind of bite the bullet and take on the kind of template constitutional language that the Bureau of Indian Affairs promoted for our first constitution in 1979. And there's lots of talk about tribal sovereignty and what that means, but and gradually that dictation of how a tribe operates has lessened. But it's an example of how tribes were kind of forced to accept certain terms in order to be recognized as a tribe. It includes the Secretary of the Interior approving our tribal constitution. So US government, to some extent, dictating the terms of our constitution. They insisted on approving all our attorney contracts in the early days, all those kinds of things. On to this. So in 1980, under our Restoration Act, we were to submit a plan for reservation to be reestablished, and there were small scattered parcels, mostly in Lincoln County. Well, I think all of them were within Lincoln County, but not all of them were within the original reservation boundary, but most of them were. We identified those 30 plus parcels and actually had a bigger idea at first, but we were told to make a modest request for these lands, about 3,600 acres of small scattered parcels, and then we could later ask for an increase in those lands. So the 1980 Reservation Act included those 30-some parcels of BLM land, and it also, because of the city vote, included the old agency headquarters at Government Hill. And shortly after, I was in high school when the Restoration Act was passed, and well, actually I was still in middle school probably when it passed. And then 1980, the Reservation Act was passed. I was a junior in high school, and in the summertime I did cutting of the blackberry patch and brush that cleared the way for this tribal community center to be built in 1983. I think they started work on it actually in 81 or 82. But that's where the kind of headquarters of our tribal cultural programs is, on Government Hill. And then 1985, we actually started construction on this larger administration building down near the river, only about a half mile from Government Hill. But our programs and staff had grown to the point where we needed that much additional space. 1996, we dedicated the permanent structure of Chinook Winds, our casino endeavor at Lincoln City. And since then, we've added a golf course and hotel and other amenities to it. It's our primary revenue generating vehicle for the tribe. And it was June of 1996 we did this dedication, and the next photo I think is probably the dance house. So one weekend apart, we dedicated our traditional ceremonial house and the casino back to back. So it was nice to have that balance between traditional cultural revival and economic independence through the casino development as well. Next photo I think is actually a dance. This is an old time dance going on at the Siletz Indian Fair. During the 19-teens, we had a series of Siletz Indian fairs that invite the broad community in, put on our own dances. And then the next slide is at the dedication of our dance house in 1996, actually being held within a ceremonial house for the first time probably since the 1870s, inside a house that was built specifically for that purpose. We do an annual run to the road, which is a reversal of our removal to the reservation. Many of our families come from the Rogue River, Chetco, Southern Oregon area, Southwest Oregon. And so this is our Head Start crew and staff and some of our adult members doing the first mile, taking off from Government Hill and starting that. I think it's about a 240-mile relay, walk, run, crawl back to the homelands in Southern Oregon. And this is mostly an elder crew was walking the Eagle Feather staff back to the last mile down to what's called Lower Oak Flats on the lower Illinois River. The Illinois River runs into the road from the south, and it's one of the places where our people agreed to stop fighting and come to the reservation. And we have generally, without the pandemic, we would have annual events in the summertime and in November. Our big outdoor powwow is one of the biggest outdoor powwows in Oregon. Nisaiga Ilahi means our land. That commemorates us getting the 1980 Reservation Act passed into law and getting Government Hill back. So our powwow grounds are right up there on the old agency grounds. And then we have the November 18th Restoration Day celebration usually. But all of those events have been canceled the last couple of years. Am I going over time?
You're just right. Thank you so much, Robert.
Yeah, sorry for the technical glitches, and thank you, Peter, for rescuing me again.
Oh, no worries at all. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
And thank you, Jesse,
Robert,
for your presentation too. It was nicely done.
Yeah, I believe Jesse had to depart for another meeting, but yeah, our thanks to him for sure.
And I should mention that, you know, the all call went out to all local tribes, and of course, not all of them could make it, like the Ko'olau tribe and some other tribes. But I'm really happy that we are able to create this space during our Indigenous Day celebration so that we can hear this history. And I am amazed by the amount of research and detail and how the information was saved and passed through generations. It's amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, our next guest speaker is Peter Hatch, and he is also from the Confederated tribe of Siletz. He's a cultural resource technician and does historical research, and he's also a board member on the Elakha Alliance. Did I say that right? Thank you. Which is reintroducing sea otters to the Oregon coast.
Hi, Diana. Thank you for that introduction. Really glad to be with you guys today.
Would you like me to start the video first?
Let me give a little context too.
Okay.
I just wanted to say, so I think we're going to be watching a short video that I worked on with some friends at the Oregon Zoo and within our Elakha Alliance organization. It's going to be giving a really excellent short overview of the material I'm going to cover today. But I wanted to thank Jesse and Robert for their presentations. And particularly, I think what I'm trying to get at today is a deep dive on what Jesse was bringing up about the fact that natural resources and culture are inseparable. You know, our way of life and the ways of life that our people have had for thousands of years on this Oregon coast that that all of us love is predicated on having a functioning environment. And there are so many places where essentially if we can change the practices that we've been doing on the environment and improve the way we do things, things will come back on their own. One case where that's not the case, you know, like I say, you take, like Jesse mentioned, you take the cows out of a field and after a while the camas is there in the seed stock and that comes back. But one vitally important resource that we've lost completely from the Oregon coast is the sea otter. And so I'm part of a project, just one cog in the wheel, but my late father was responsible for kicking off this effort in the 90s to at the beginning just really raise awareness of the lack of these animals, because we can go and see them at the aquarium and we assume that perhaps that there are sea otters off the Oregon coast, and we occasionally get a single one drifting down from Washington, but we've been without them, and the lack of that is meaningful for reasons that the video is going to go into. Yeah, we'll just watch the video for 6 or 7 minutes, and then I'll be happy to maybe take questions after.
This coast is such a place of raw and tremendous power where the world's biggest ocean comes up against the land, but it's also a nurturing place, the place that has sustained my ancestors and sustains all of us to this day. We rely on the bounty that the upwelling of the Pacific brings to our ecosystem. It's easy to come to this beautiful place and get the sense that because it's beautiful, everything is as it should be. But unfortunately, we inherit an ecosystem that is out of balance. And in large part, that's because of the absence of one particular animal, the sea otter. Since time before human memory, the people of this coast, my ancestors, shared our waters with sea otters. My name is Peter Hatch, and I'm a Siletz tribal member of Coos and Siuslaw descent. Stories from our ancestors talk about a time when the boundaries between what we now think of as the human world and the animal world were a lot more fluid than they are today. There's an old story about a young Coos woman who married into the sea otter people and went to live out to sea and established a connection between us human people and the animal people that carries down through the generations. That relationship benefits both of us. Fundamentally, a lot of these beliefs boil down to trying to instill an appreciation for the resources that sustain us. By eating the sea urchins, sea otters keep them in check and help our kelp forests thrive. Modern ecology has been catching up to those ancestral understandings, those interconnections that people who've lived in this place have always known are there. In the different languages and dialects up and down the Oregon coast, there are at least 6 different words for sea otter. Near what we now call Depot Bay is a place that has been known to local Tillamook folks as Asihigil Shantish, which means Otter Rock, and today is known in English as Otter Rock Marine Reserve. Down south is a rocky point that Dani people have always known as Hushkushse, which again just means Sea Otter Rock. Today it's still known in English as Otter Point. These place names and these stories are all we have left of Oregon's original sea otter population. The last Oregon sea otter that we know of was killed around 1910. The slaughter of Oregon sea otters occurred in parallel with the catastrophes that were affecting Indigenous people of this region in the 19th century. Between the wars, the disease, the loss of land, the loss of life, the boarding schools, termination policy, and just the pure stigma around being Indian, it's a very real possibility that Oregon's tribes could have been wiped out completely. Sometimes we treat this very near history as ancient, but my great-grandmother Hattie was the only survivor among 9 brothers and sisters. My grandfather grew up around people who had been there at the signing of the treaties in the 1850s. My dad's generation grew up as members of a tribe that, in the eyes of the government, no longer existed. These historical forces shape who our families are and how many of us there are even to this day. Despite it all, we survived and Oregon's sea otters didn't, and that relationship was broken. Back in the late 90s, my dad, Dave Hatch, was looking for a name for a small boat that we'd built together, and in a Chinook dictionary happened across the term Elakha for sea otter. As my dad started to dig deeper, he started to realize how much all Oregonians stood to gain by restoring sea otters to our ocean. That led down a path of research, activism, and connecting people that formed the Elakha Alliance. After his passing in 2016, we got back together, a group of us that had been touched by his work, to make something meaningful out of that. It was time to try to bring them back. Today we face tremendous uncertainties about the future of the Oregon coast. There are many threats, and in so many ways we're always on defense. But this project is a chance to do something proactive. We have the power to heal this place where we live. It's not about grasping for what little we have left. It's about trying to restore something that we've lost and thereby create a better future. We have a tremendous effort ahead and many people that need to be at the table as decisions are made. But there's hope here, there's potential here, and many people who have heard about this project have met us with tremendous good spirit and have offered their help as we move forward. Long after I'm gone, I hope that my descendants will still be able to go to these rivers on this coast to gather mussels and to fish for salmon, and that when they're out there offshore, they'll see Elakha. We're not just restoring a species, we're bringing back a relative.
Okay, thank you guys very much for watching. And let's see, I'm happy to present more but I feel like you guys have gotten a fair bit of PowerPoint today. So if you prefer, I can just answer any questions that you guys might care to put in the chat. But basically, where we're at as an Elakha Alliance organization is that we formed as a formal nonprofit back in 2017, and trying to, we've been really fortunate to have Robert Kentta, who just spoke, and the late Don Ivy of the Ko'olau Indian tribe, who is so important also to the history of SWOCC, as well as Chief Doc Slider of the Confederated Tribes of Coos, Umpqua, and Siuslaw on our board. And so it's always been part of the vision of the organization to enable the restoration of this cultural connection if we can, but also to be deeply tied into the science and the many communities that rely on Oregon coastal resources to make sure that if a reintroduction were to go forward, it can take place in an environment of regional consensus, where we can do what we can to address the concerns of, say, folks who make their living off of the Dungeness crab or the sea urchin, and all the other things that we rely on the coast, because there are inherently trade-offs to any kind of attempts to restore a part of the ecosystem that's missing. Yeah, let's see. So haven't seen any questions come up yet, but what I do want to encourage is that, especially those of you who are here from the Native American Student Alliance Club, to consider, for me, the sea otter, there's a personal background and a long history of getting involved in this particular work, but there is so much need out there, and there are so many areas, whether it's language or environment or water or just so many different needs out there, or if you have the capacity or the desire to serve as an educator, there's so much more ability to go and work for your tribe or work for nonprofits that are out there doing important work. And so your skills, your knowledge, whether you feel like you have them yet or you feel like you're still developing them, are necessary, and we need your voice at the table, and you will find a receptive ear and folks who are looking to incorporate Indigenous voices into the work that they do. That's not always easy. Things don't, it's not inherent that there's shared interests or correspondence between folks looking for conservation and Indigenous people. I sometimes talk about the example of how often in the history of the country, like, part of establishing the national parks in any given place was kicking out the people who had lived there and tended those places for countless generations. But we're in many ways in a new era where those voices in conservation are really important, and so there's a place for you at the table if you desire to be there. So let me see here.
I
can
don't
go
see
ahead
any
and-
questions so far, Peter.
Yeah.
But I would like to note that for many Native families, the term all my relations extends to the plants, the animals, and the insects all around us. And by the way, the Native Student Alliance Club and the Associated Student Government offered to pay our speakers and artists in the YouTube videos a small stipend, but all of them graciously declined. So the students have decided to donate some of those funds to the Elakha Alliance.
Well, that's the first I've heard, and I'm really gratified that you guys are willing to do that. I did want to back up then, since we don't seem to have questions coming up through the chat at this time, and cover just a few quick basics. So first of all, it's very likely, if you've spent much time out along our rivers, that you've seen a good many river otters, and maybe you've even seen those in estuaries or the intertidal zone, because they do sometimes go looking here. But there is a big fundamental difference. Sea otters are about 3 times the size and feed almost exclusively on different kinds of shellfish, whereas river otters are a lot more likely to eat finfish. And river otters can have 3 or 4 pups at a time. So among animals, pretty much animals that reproduce faster, if they are hunted out of a local area, are better able to repopulate pretty quickly and fill the niches where they've been gone. Whereas for a sea otter trying to make its way in the cold, rough Pacific Ocean, they raise 1 pup at a time. And it's an incredibly intensive thing for a mother sea otter to raise a pup. And so they bounce back a lot more slowly. And the other fundamental thing to know about their biology is that, as opposed to the other marine mammals that are so important off our coast, like whales or orcas or seals or sea lions, they don't have blubber to insulate between the cold Pacific and themselves. So they basically make up for it by eating a ton to keep that internal furnace running, and also by having the softest, thickest fur in the world. And so that's what characterizes a lot of their interactions with people over thousands of years, is that incredibly soft fur, for better or for worse. And so that story that I brought up in the video, by the way, I want to take a moment to provide specific credit to the storyteller, and the reason why that story in the Coos language is preserved for us today is because of a local to your guys' area, and the area where my family's originally from, Coos Bay, Annie Minor Peterson, Coos woman whose mother was from Intestich Village, down right in your guys' neck of the woods, and whose family was subject to the same historical forces that Jesse was talking about in the presentation, moved from place to place and dispossessed of their land, and striving to get by. And so she was one of the people who was still around or had moved back to Coos Bay, her home country, by the 1930s, and was there to be recorded by anthropologist, linguist from the University of Washington, who was rambling around in those summers in the 30s, kind of collecting what he could from the elders up and down the coast. And that's Melville Jacobs. And so that's them too, in that particular picture, with his big old disc recording machine. Anyway, so sea otter skins are and have always been really culturally important for our people as just a part of one of the beautiful expressions of the things that come from our lands and waters. And you know, I was counting up to talk about the intersection between ecosystems and our people and Indigenous perspectives on this, just as a simple exercise for my own understanding. I was given a presentation to another group last month, and Robert showed that slide of feather dancers at the dedication of the dance house in 1996. And I was looking at just how many different species from our environment are drawn together in that regalia for that ceremony. And to underline the point that, you know, you need an ecosystem to hold a feather dance. And so just taking one single pretty typical set of men's regalia in one picture and one pretty typical set of women's regalia in the other, you know, there's a lot shared between them. They both use deer hide, they both used the woodpecker scarlet, different things like that, but it was 26 different species between plants and animals that are represented, not including you know, a whole heck of a lot of Western red cedar to build that dance house. I see some questions are coming up in the chat now, so let me bring that up. Let's see. So, oh yeah, so Elakha is the old-time Chinook language for Chinook people on either side of the mouth of the Columbia. But the reason that word spread throughout the Northwest is because Chinook people have always been traders up and down the coast at that kind of strategic point where their original territory is from, right where the you know, the Great Big Columbia River meets the ocean. And so they were very involved when foreign traders came to begin the fur trade. And so the trade language that includes a lot of terms from English and French and even a little bit of Hawaiian and other languages from up and down the coast that they developed to communicate during the fur trade, called Chinook jargon or Chinook wawa, is at its base, like the core of it comes from Chinook. And so that's what the term Elakha is about. And then you were asking about Milik language, and I think, though I would have to check with folks who are better linguists than I, Giyuwe would be the term in both Hanas and Milik dialects of Coos for sea otter. And oh, I see. Oh, and Robert got to that question. Thank you for answering in text, Robert. So let's see. Just to keep on mentioning here. So one thing we know is that there's sea otter bones all throughout the material remains of village life at the different ancestral sites up and down the coast. So right at any given place that's now an archaeological site, as folks dig through our ancestors' old middens, right behind those seals and sea lions that people relied on so heavily for their oil, is sea otter, and that people were, as far as I can tell, not eating, but relying upon for their incredibly warm, incredibly beautiful fur. And so as I mentioned again in the video, that legacy of the presence of sea otters is just right underneath our awareness. So that a lot of the place names that are still preserved in English as Otter Point and Otter Rock just translate right back to that in the indigenous language of the area. Meaning, I think that, you know, they're oftentimes, those names are given to pretty shallow rocks near the tidal influence where sea otters would come to rest and haul out on land. And so those are probably places where people and otters have interacted as long as our sea levels have been in the ballpark in the neighborhood that they are now for thousands of years. And if we go through the stories and recollections of where people talk about their ancestors hunting sea otters, even sometimes people talking, you know, 40 or more years after sea otters were extinct in the area, and often 80 or more years after their own family had been removed from that zone of the coast, it lines up just practically one for one with where we would expect there to be good sea otter habitat as scientists, as ecologists look at what conditions are like today. And so let me skip ahead and just say that the reason why this is all so important is that in the absence of a predator to keep their numbers in check, sea urchins absolutely can go crazy, and it's as if it's like a forest on land with too many grazers in it, like deer or elk, where they can just completely shape the landscape by overgrazing. And the same is true of sea urchins in our nearshore forests, especially where there's rocky bottom, like right off of Cape Arago, or especially south in Cape Blanco, Port Orford area off Humbug Mountain, where there are tremendous reefs that should be really consistent and healthy kelp forests, but that in a lot of cases are converted over completely to urchin barren. And basically an urchin barren only supports urchins and barely supports them. They kind of, once they run out of food, they shrivel up and go dormant. They call them almost like zombie urchins. They are covering the ocean floor, whereas a kelp forest, just like a forest on land, you know, supports all kinds of different organisms all the way up the food chain and the different layers of the kelp and the protection that it offers. And the kelp itself is a big, well, at least is one factor in storing carbon that would otherwise remain in the atmosphere. And so that's why ecologists basically catching up to that ancestral understanding that goes right back to the story that I mentioned in the video about sea otters being inherently related to the prosperity that we experience in our landscape. They are what's called a keystone species. And that means that they punch well above their weight in terms of their ability to influence the environment around them by keeping those shellfish in check. And so this is something that's actively happening off our coast, as unfortunately especially right there off Port Orford, where we've had urchin divers commercially for a long time. They did a pretty good job for a long while, kind of replacing that ecological role by harvesting urchins for human consumption. But as fewer people are doing that, I think there are only 3 permits for commercial urchin divers on the coast right now. There are lots of areas that had been able to come back as kelp forests that are converting back over to urchin barren. And so that's why I see this all as important, and an area where tribes have an inherent role in trying to chart a better future for in our case, Western Oregon, where our people come from, but that's echoed, across the country, and tribal governments are involved in all kinds of different things, whether it's, in a lot of different areas of the West, trying to restore the relationship between humans and fire and the landscape, and using the prescribed burns that Indigenous people have always done to, restoring those practices in order to manage fuels and try to mitigate the devastating wildfires that we get if an area hasn't burned in decades and decades and decades, because those traditional management practices have been suppressed. And that's just one of many, many, many examples where tribes and restoring those practices are leading the way. And I hope, charting a future for Oregon and the West and the US and the world that is a little bit better than where we might be heading otherwise. So let's see. So Ashley asks, do sea otters utilize estuaries as a habitat or stick to shorelines? So there's basically, we think of sea otters as an ocean critter, but they do, and it seems like in the historical record in Oregon, they did utilize our estuaries. And we've got a lot of big, deep estuaries with a lot of shellfish that they definitely would have. And there are really good examples down in California where they've been continuing to work to bring the population back at places like there's an estuary down off of Monterey Bay called Elkhorn Slough that they've used for as kind of a protected but wild environment to rear orphaned pups. I mentioned earlier about how intensive a process it is for a mother sea otter to raise a pup, and how much hunting she has to do in order to eat for two. And sometimes if it's between her survival and her pup's survival, pups will be abandoned in the wild. And so the Monterey Bay Aquarium has a rearing program to bring those abandoned pups up with surrogate mothers when they're found, and then ends up releasing a lot of them into Elkhorn Slough. And then as they've been able to observe, that's had a surprisingly good impact on the eelgrass populations and on just basic water quality. As the eelgrass bounces back, it's just an echo of the same thing that happens offshore, is that having that predator in at the top of the ecosystem just helps keep everything in much better balance in those eelgrass estuaries. So yeah, otters and estuaries are important, and it could be so. We've just gotten to where we're releasing a feasibility study. We are not at the point of proposing a reintroduction plan. Basically, we're just trying to figure out scientifically, if we did this, would this work? Because it was tried once in Oregon before in the late 70s, and it failed then. Basically, it seems like the sea otters survived over the course of years, but then just their population dwindled down below a population where they could sustain themselves. And they lost a bunch immediately. It's hard to tell really whether that was because of poor animal handling and failing to move sea otters in full social groups. That groups of mothers and babies tend to really stick together, and that can matter a great deal. And it's also that these were northern otters from Alaska, and some of them may have immediately just gone off north or rejoined with the introductions that were going on at the same time off the Washington coast, where those reintroductions did succeed. And so yeah, that's the story of Oregon Sea Otters. It's where we're at. We're at the stage of trying to get together the money to hire the best people to do the research, to find out whether this could be feasible, and to assess what a plan would look like, and then also to do outreach with all of the different communities on the coast, including you guys, to make sure that that everyone who should have a voice in this process does and knows about it, and that no one feels blindsided the way that so often things, when there are even good things that are that come up through conservation, people feel as if their interests aren't being heard. You know, it's not our goal that anyone be surprised by this or feel like they've been they haven't had a seat at the table when they should. So that's yeah, that's what I'm about, or at least when I have my Sea Otter hat on. One of the things that that I'm involved in that's very important to me. And okay, let's see. How much money is needed and where are you at now? So I don't actually know the dollar figure for trying to develop a reintroduction plan, which would kind of be our next big lift. But I think in order to get the time for the team of scientists from the US and Canada that we contracted with for the feasibility study, I think that was about $120,000 effort, plus another third of that or so that ended up going toward making sure that we had another team working on an economic impact assessment to try to weigh out the difference, you know, that they're try to understand the potential impacts to commercial fisheries and tourism and the ups and downs of what would be expected if a reintroduction were to take place. So that's where we're at now, and we are definitely looking for more supporters. You know, we do have a pandemic on, and a lot of families are struggling with their own resources. But if you're doing well, if you've kept your job, if you're looking to help out, we would absolutely love a donation. And we would also love invitations to come and speak. If there are other groups that you're affiliated with that you want to, that you ought to think should hear about what's going on, reach out to me. And I think Diana can distribute contact information for Robert and Jesse and I if we like. I saw that Jesse left his email in the chat. I can do the same. And we're also, for those of you in the Native American Student Alliance, we have some grant applications out looking for a couple of young tribal members to help out with our communications and community outreach efforts, particularly for getting the message out within the membership of Oregon's 3 coastal tribes, because although I try to do what I can as an individual, you know, there are 5,000 Siletz tribal members, or 5,500 spread all around the world, and so there's always more to be done in terms of outreach and in terms of helping with messaging that's understandable, culturally appropriate. And so we're looking to, hopefully sometime in early 2022, if those grants are funded, look out for those applications to be out there. And it'd be really nice if one of you is able to join us, because particularly in terms of it's likely that the South Coast is kind of the key set of communities for this big effort that we're undertaking, and so we're always looking for people with deep roots in those communities.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was amazing. And I will say that there is a tremendous drive in the students to not only learn science, all kinds of science, but also to go back a little bit more towards conservation and towards traditional knowledge. And so you'll be hearing from the students for sure. Thank you so much. So right now, I do have a video that I think is appropriate for this time. It's again from PAMYUA, and it is a drum song, which is a prayer to the ocean. Thank you so much again, Peter. So we're going to switch gears a little bit here. Our next artist is DJ Shub, and he is from Canada. And one of the things that he does is that he combines more modern music with some tribal music. And in this particular video, it's called Indomitable. And it does a good job of showing that some people blend their modern life and then keeping their cultural things alive. And that's one of the topics that we often have with our students is how to make that family cultural calendar, or blending your work and your culture. It also shows a really good job of connections. This particular video features a drum group called Northern Cree Singers, as they sing in part a round dance, which is one of the many dance forms practiced at powwows. By the way, many tribes had different forms of powwows, which were later outlawed by the Commissioner of Indian Affairs in 1921, but many families continued the tradition in private. Most powwows today are multi-tribal and usually have a format of grand entry followed by dance competitions, and they always follow powwow etiquette. Today, families and tribes still have songs and dances. Some of them are more private, and some of them have been developed to be more public. These traditions are as varied as the languages. The word indomitable means impossible to subdue or defeat. For this video, you are absolutely encouraged to move to the beat and clap your hands, or your split sticks if you have them. As we honor the contributions and culture of Indigenous people, I want to take a moment to honor our students here at SWOCC. I wish you could see how hard they study as they navigate college, either here on campus or remotely in their own homes. Many of them balance school with work or family or sports or all of the above. Many of our students also take on the extra task of going back to learn their native language and cultural history. The younger generation is very fortunate to have cultural educators like Jesse Beers, Robert Kentta, and Peter Hatch. And they were, in turn, fortunate to have elders who held on to their traditions despite all the adversity. So to the past, present, and future Indigenous people, we honor you. Thanks again to our guest speakers, and thank you for joining Southwestern Oregon Community College Indigenous Day 2021 celebration. We absolutely look forward to seeing you next year. Thank you.